So my name is Erica Sue. I'm the Deputy Director of the Tobacconomics Think Tanks Project, and I'm joined by Priscilla Tiga, Policy and Research Advisor in Cancer Research UK's Global Program. Thank you for your interest in this newly released tobacco control supplement on measuring illicit trade. The webinar will include 4 brief presentations on selected articles in the supplement, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session, which Priscilla will lead. So please have your questions ready. And we'll address those at the end. You can send in your questions via the Q&A box. And in case you missed something, please feel free to email us at info@tobacconomics.org after the session. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, today's webinar is being recorded along with a PowerPoint presentation. These items will be on the Tobacconomics website. So please note that everything, including your questions and comments, will be made public. And last, we would love to hear from you and get your feedback about today's session. So after the session, you'll receive a link to a very brief survey to provide your feedback. And we really appreciate your time to help us improve our dissemination efforts. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. So first is Dr. Hana Ross. She is the Principal Research Officer at the Research Unit on the Economics of Excisable Products at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Dr. Ross studies the economic impact of tobacco control interventions in Africa, Southeast Asia, and in the European Union. She also works on issues related to illicit trade in tobacco, including measuring the size of tax avoidance and evasions and strategies to control the illicit cigarette market. Dr. Ross received a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Next is Dr. Tsetsegsaikhan Batmunkh. She's founder and CEO of the National Cancer Council of Mongolia. She's worked as an advisor to Mongolia's health minister and an officer of public health at the Public Health Department in the Ministry of Health and at the World Health Organization in Mongolia. Dr. Batmunkh received her bachelor's in medicine, her master's degree in public health and health management from the University of New South Wales in Australia, and her PhD from the People's Friendship University of Russia. Our next presenter, hopefully, will be Dr. George Bakhturidze. He's a medical doctor and a lawyer and associate professor at the University of Georgia. He's been involved in tobacco control activities since 1998 and in negotiations regarding the WHO FCTC since 2000. He's also co-author of Georgia's national tobacco control legislations that were developed in 2003, 2008, and 2017. Currently, he is a consultant for the WHO country office in Georgia on tobacco control issues, including illicit trade. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Ang Wen. He's the co-founder and chief economist at the Development and Policies Research Center, also known as DEPICENT, in Vietnam. And prior to co-founding DEPICENT in 2005, he was an economic advisor for the Economic Committee of the National Assembly of Vietnam. Ang earned his master's degree in international trade and finance and his PhD in economics from Lancaster University in the UK. So welcome to all our speakers. And now first I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Hana Ross. Hana, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Erica, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. We have a few interesting studies to share with you, and so please, Margaret, next slide. So would like to give you a little bit of a background about these studies. It all started in about 2016 when several researchers met in Chicago at the University of Illinois and discussed how to address an issue that it keeps coming up during the discussions about tobacco tax increases, and that is the issue of illicit trade. Because tobacco industry is constantly using the argument of illicit trade as a way to discourage governments to increase tobacco taxes. So we already knew from previous studies that countries with low cigarette prices usually have a high level of illicit trade. But actually what we quite didn't know is how illicit trade would respond directly to tax change. So this whole study was designed around tax changes and measuring the size of illicit trade before and after a tax increase. So the design was basically based on knowing which country is going to have a tax increase and ability to collect data before that tax increase. So in the end, it was gracefully funded by Cancer Research UK. And in the end, we selected 4 countries where we knew that these conditions were met and where we can conduct this experiment. Next slide, please. So we selected on our team, there were 4 countries that we selected. It was South Africa, Gambia, Mongolia, and Georgia. So we knew in these countries the tax would increase, but the problem was that if we have the intelligence about tax increase, we never know how the decision about the tax increase is going to actually turn out on the last moment, because sometimes the tax increase has to be voted on in a parliament or other legislative bodies. So it is always a little bit of uncertain where if the tax increase is actually going to happen. And in case of Mongolia, we learned about the possibility of tax increase, but only a few months before the tax increase was going into a place. And that didn't give us really a lot of time to organize data collection, but we managed in Mongolia, primarily thanks to my colleague Tsegi, that will then tell you the story of Mongolia. But in few countries, we actually had a little bit of bad luck with tax not being increased, but we managed. So the methodology in these countries was driven primarily by their local specific knowledge, because each country has a little bit different features of PACs, and therefore we had to adjust the methodology given these features of these individual markets. Next, please. Oh. So the first country I'm going to be talking about is Gambia. Next, please. So Gambia is, you can see the map, is an interesting country that is surrounded by Senegal and has a little bit of access to the ocean, otherwise a pretty much landlocked country with a lot of borders with Senegal. So this was one of the countries where we were expecting tax increase, but the tax increase didn't happen. Next, please. So what we did instead, we already were organizing national representative survey. And so since there was no additional and there was no tax increase that follow, we just used our baseline data from that survey as an estimate of the size of illicit trade in Gambia, because this estimate was new to the country, nobody has done it before. And so it was still contribution to the literature. We use a 2-stage clustering sampling, and which in the end, let me just, which is also called probability proportional to size. So in the end, we managed to interview 2,700 smokers, one in each of these 2,700 households. And these households came from 135 enumeration area that were randomly selected from the enumeration area in all Gambia. Next, please. So what did we find? We used 2 criteria to determine if a PAG was legal or illegal. The first one was price, because we learned from local Ministry of Finance that there's a certain price threshold. So we found that about 8.6% of cigarette packs were below this legal price threshold. And so that was one of our estimates of illicit trade. We also, in these households, we were also observing packs. And because the packs have to have certain features, based on the features of the pack, we determined that only less than 1%, only 3 cigarette packs out of 313 packs that we were able to observe didn't have correct features. So that was actually, on that estimate would give us less than 1% of an illicit trade market. Next, please. So we then looked at which brands were the ones that were most prevalent. This slide got a little bit distorted, I'm afraid, but nevertheless, the first one, the tallest one, is Piccadilly brand. And that's the one that was most frequently found to be illicit. And interestingly enough, after we finished the study, we provided information to Ministry of Finance and local enforcement officers, and they conducted several raids on different shops and found this Piccadilly brand, and actually were able to use the results of our study to profile that brand and more frequently then look for that particular brand as a potential illicit brand. Next slide, please. So in South Africa, we have two kinds of studies in South Africa. So the one that I'm going to tell you about is the one that is where we collected data in South African townships. Next one. So it was a household survey, but it wasn't nationally representative because we couldn't do nationally representative surveys for two reasons. First, it would be quite expensive. Second, we actually wanted to focus on townships because those are areas where low-income smokers live. And we don't know a lot about low-income smokers in South Africa. So this was also a way how to sort of look at smoking behavior among low-income smokers. So here, what we used as a method was again a price threshold. In South Africa, there are no signs on a pack that would tell us if the pack is legal or illegal. So we had to use this price threshold again, and for us it was any pack or any stick, and if a stick was sold for less than R1, and then we knew that the price, that particular stick had to be illicit because just the taxes alone would represent almost close to R1 per stick. So in this case, we had a tax increase between the first data collection and the second data collection. Even though the tax increase was only small, it was only 4%. We measured that the overall share of illicit cigarettes in that low-income population was about 34.6% in the first round and 36.4% in the second round. There was a slight increase, but this increase was not statistically significant. And interestingly enough, we confirmed the same share of illicit market in South Africa using another study called gap analysis, where we looked at the whole country as data from the whole country, and that was nationally representative. So we came to more or less the same conclusion about the share of illicit trade in South Africa. Next, please. So what were the key messages, at least from the overall experience doing these studies? The design has to be country specific because each country is different. So even though we have some, established methodologies, they need to be tweaked and adjusted to country conditions. It's important to talk to policymakers and other stakeholders when you're designing the study, because they can actually inform the design of a study. But it's also good to talk to them before you release the data, because this is a very sensitive topic. So it's good that policymakers know in advance that you're gonna, release a study that's gonna tell that your country has 40% or 30% market share illicit. So that's because that can be quite sensitive politically. And it's important to anticipate some obstacles and prepare in advance solutions. So for example, what will happen if the tax increase doesn't happen? How do we respond to that? Are we going to end study that now at that point, or are we going to continue and try to estimate something else? Being flexible is important, but still you need to still adhere to scientific principles. Important is also to working with experienced statisticians, particularly in these studies that don't have a large budget. You cannot afford often a national representative sample. So there are ways to get something still meaningful. And this is where a statistician can really be very helpful and save money on collecting data. Double check the data entry and data analysis. We had in Mongolia and in other countries, whenever we had a data entry, we then double check, had somebody else coded data again, just to make sure that we were, that we got, that the results didn't have any mistakes. And it's also important to process data relatively quickly, because all this information is quite sensitive, and disseminate information quite widely. As we have seen in Gambia, for example, the moment we released the results, police went to these stores and had a very successful seizures of many illicit cigarettes. So I think that's all from me. So thank you very much for your attention. And I now would like to invite my colleague Tsegi from Mongolia, who's going to tell us about the study that she was leading in that country. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to present the study on the impact of tax increase on illicit trade in Mongolia. Next slide, please. So like in many low and middle income countries, the smoking prevalence in Mongolia is quite high, especially for men. According to the latest study from 2019, 44% of males and 5% of females were smokers. And if we see compare with the data from 2015, there was not a big difference. So it means that the policies and the policies on tobacco control are not really working in our country. And like in many other countries, tobacco importers or manufacturers would say that higher taxes for tobacco will incentivize tax evasion and tax avoidance. And that's why the goal of our study was to estimate whether the changes of tobacco taxes and avoidance evasion after tax increases. And in Mongolia, the government increased the tax for imported cigarettes from 1st of May in 2017 by 30%, and excise tax was increased by 10% from 1st of January in 2018. So next slide, please. And we selected the capital city Ulaanbaatar and selected 50 small administrative units out of 150, and 2 provinces, one bordering with China and one bordering with Russia and partly with Kazakhstan. And data was collected in 3 waves as a baseline just before the tax increase. And the next second wave was after import tax increase, and third wave was after excise tax increase in 2018. Next slide, please. So we were recording whether the packs having the presence of Mongolian tax stamp, or whether the graphic and healthcare warnings were correct, and the presence of duty-free signs. And packs were collected on the streets, on the ground, or at the top of the waste bins. And a cigarette pack was identified as illicit if it had no excise tax stamp or evidence that there was no excise tax stamp. Next slide, please. So we identified, we were collecting around 6,000 to 7,000 packs from all places. And in first wave, around 14.7% of packs were illicit, when in second wave, the picture was almost the same, 13.6% of cigarette packs were illicit. When in third wave, it was interesting that around 6% of the cigarettes were illicit, so the number had decreased by 2 times. Next slide, please. And if we see the tendency of this illicit trade in different places, the picture was almost the same, whether not depending where it was collected. So the UBCT or different provinces had the same tendency and picture. Next slide, please. And the most common brands were the Tsetsegsaikhan from Korea and Westred from Ukraine. So also the picture was almost the same in all waves, in all places, consistently. Next slide, please. And we found out that in wave 1 and 2, the picture was almost the same. The most illicit cigarettes were from Korea, then from Ukraine, Kazakhstan, some Mongolian brands as well, and just small portion from Russia. When in the third wave, we identified that the most illicit cigarettes were from Ukraine. So the picture has changed. And on the second place was Korea, Kazakhstan, and other countries. So next slide, please. And in terms of manufacturers, we found out that in wave 1 and 2, the most of cigarettes were from KT&G from Korea and Imperial Factory from Ukraine, and local manufacturer and Philip Morris from Kazakhstan. When in third wave, it was Ukrainian brand and manufacturer was Imperial Factory. Next slide, please. And also within this study, we looked at the pictorial health warnings, and according to the standards, all manufacturers or importers should place the same proportion of the pictorial warnings, but we identified that the importers or manufacturers using the use some pictorial warnings more frequently, which people just buy. Next slide, please. And put less pictorial warnings with these ugly photos of cancer or necrosis. So we identified that they are not following the rules. Next slide, please. And also in all waves, we identified that the packs use the special promotional features, like this cigarette is super slim, or it has less smoke odors, this kind of things. Next slide, please. And as a summary, we can say that in Mongolia, there was no difference in illicit trade after tax increase, especially for import tax and excise tax. And cigarette without tax stamp were mostly produced in Korea, Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, and some local Mongolian brand. And manufacturers were KT&G, Imperial Factory, and Mongol Tampso, and Philip Morris. And the share of packs with special promotional features like super slim or less smoke odors was around 50% in all waves. And manufacturers or importers using some pictorial warnings, which people are buying mostly. So next slide, please. And using this opportunity, I would like to thank Cancer Research UK for funding this study, and University of Cape Town, Professor Hana Ross, for collaborating and guiding us throughout this study. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite my colleague from Georgia to present this study. Thank you.
So thank you, Tsegi. This is Hana again, not George. George, this seemed to be running a little bit late today. So can we possibly move to Vietnam and then come back to Georgia? There is still some hope that George will come. So now let's give floor to our colleague, Anh Nguyen from Deposen. Thank you.
Good evening, good morning. So hello everybody. Okay. So good morning everybody. So it's a kind of good pleasure to present our study on the illicit trade in Vietnam. So I'd like to go back a little bit about the, provide you a little bit about the background of the tobacco and the consumptions and the effort to control the tobacco in Vietnam. As you can see in the graph, you can see that Vietnam during the last 10 years has gradually increased the tax rate, right? But however, the taxation rate in Vietnam is still very low, and therefore tobacco is still very highly affordable in Vietnam. And during the last few years, there's been a kind of ongoing tax reform in order to cope with the high prevalence of smoking in Vietnam. And the proposal to increase the tax rate has been around for the last few years, but there's some argument promoted by the tobacco industry that when you increase the taxation rate, then it will lead to higher illicit trade. So our study would like to look at whether this is so. So this is the background of our study. Next slide, please. So in order to know whether a cigarette, a pack of cigarette is licit or illicit, in the case of Vietnam, we can identify a number of features according to the law. The pack of cigarette must have the graphic warnings and also have a stamp. So in order to identify it is illicit. In the survey, if a pack lacks both the tax stamp and the graphic warning, so we consider it as a illicit cigarette. Next slide, please. The methodology we use in this study, there was a study conducted in 2012 by Hana Ross and a number of colleagues from UICs in 2012. That survey was conducted in 12 provinces, and in our study, we basically replicate the same methodologies. So our survey was conducted in 9 provinces in Vietnam, in 3 regions, and we surveyed 2,700 households, including the smoker, and the population include people who are more than 18. So the provinces are chosen to replicate the previous study. So in order for us to do the comparisons, and the random sampling was selected, and our study was designed to be a kind of a national representative to make the number robust. Next slide, please. And here is the result. As you can see, we presented both the result from previous study in 2012 and our study was conducted in 2017. So in contrast to the narrative that has been floating around by the tobacco industry, that by increasing the tax, the illicit trade will increase. But actually, we observe from the 2012 and 2017, the number of illicit trade, illicit cigarette has been reducing. So there's a significant decline in the illicit trade between the 2 points of the study. And it's very important to note that we use the same sampling frame and the same methodologies. So we believe that the result is very robust. Next slide, please. And because we conducted study in 3 regions, and we able to do the analysis in the 3 regions. So we can see that the almost all of the illicit trade happened both in 2012 and 2017 in the southern province that is near to the Cambodian border, where most of the illegal smuggling of the cigarette are happening. And in the north or in the central part of Vietnam, you know, the number of illicit cigarettes are very few. Next slide, please. So what are the illicit brands? Because we collect the packs, so we have been able to identify the brands. So we found that both Jet and Hero are the most popular illicit brand in Vietnam, and they happened to be in the southern part of Vietnam. It's important to note that Jet and Hero are not legally available in Vietnam. They are imported illegally in Vietnam, and they are Indonesian brands, and they imported through Laos or Cambodia. There are a few, there are triple fives and Craven A. They are legally available and produced locally, but the number is very small. Next slide, please. So we also do a check with the GAT survey to see if our results are robust. So here you can see that a consistent downward, consistent decline of the illicit trade in Vietnam from 2010 to 2017. We were able to compare different point in time, and the trend is downward. So the narrative by the industry that illicit trade is increasing is not correct. Next slide, please. In addition to seeing that the illicit trade in Vietnam is declining, we also to look at another aspect of the narrative that the industry has been promoting. That is the illegal or illicit cigarettes are cheaper than the legal ones. So we look at the price of those brands, and we found that the illicit cigarettes are much more expensive than the licit cigarette, and the premium is much higher in the central and the northern provinces in Vietnam, and the premium between the licit and the licit and illicit has been also increasing from 2012 and 2017, the 2 points of our study. Next slide, please. Here also, basically, this slide saying the same story. That is, the price premium has increased between the 2 points. So one of the questions that we would like also to know is why the illicit cigarettes are more expensive in Vietnam. Usually, the narrative by the industry that is cheaper, so that people will buy the illicit trade because of the tax increase. But it's not so in Vietnam. So we also look at the relation between the income and the illicit tobacco. And in the later slide, I will show you that actually it's a taste in Vietnam that the people in Vietnam prefer the illicit products because we consider it as a premium product, and the consumption between the two there's a marked difference between the two groups who are consuming the illicit and who are consuming the licit product. Next slide, please. So the narrative promoted by the tobacco manufacturer that the illicit trade is about tax evasion, and then illicit cigarettes should be cheap or at least cheaper than tax paid. But this is not the case in Vietnam. So our studies show that the illicit cigarettes are actually more expensive than the domestic licit cigarettes. And this, this is a very good, important evidence to undermine the narrative of tax increases resulting in illicit cigarette trade. Next slide, please. So in summary or in conclusion, you see that the illicit trade has declined in Vietnam between 2012 and 2017. And this decline happened to coincide with the increases in the ad valorem excise tax rate throughout this period. If you recall the very first slide I showed you, that the tax in Vietnam has been increasing. Our study also showed that the price of the illicit cigarette are more expensive than the legal one. And maybe it is a result of the taste of smoker in Vietnam, and there's no evidence to suggest that further tax increase will result in higher illicit trade prevalence in Vietnam. Next slide, please. As I promised, this slide, show that there's a gap between those who are consuming the licit cigarette or the illicit cigarette. So those who are in Vietnam, if you look at the individual income or the household income in both cases, it shows that those who have high income will tend to consume the illicit cigarette. So the situation in Vietnam is maybe a little bit different from other countries. That is, it is the taste of those higher income people. They would like to they perceive that illicit trade imported illegally have a higher quality. So that's why they consume the illegal imported products.
Thank you, Ang. Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to pass on to Hannah in the interest of time, just so we have time for a couple of questions. Hannah will be covering George's slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you, Anne. That was a very interesting presentation. And I have to say, we found something similar in Georgia in relationship to the border. What really make the biggest difference in Georgia is a proximity to a border with occupied territory. So, so we, again, not a nationally representative survey, but it was done in 5 different places, regions in Georgia, and we had almost 3,000 interviews that we completed. Next slide, please. Let's skip this one. Let's go next. So, sorry, can you do the previous one? Let's do the previous. Yeah. So this is the result of the observation. So in the end, yeah, sorry, I'm not familiar with these slides, but so most of them were filter cigarettes. Okay, next slide. And most of the smokers showed us the pack. So it was based on a face-to-face survey where we interviewed smokers and asked them to show their pack. Next slide, please. Okay, so there was one of the drawbacks there that we actually had about 22% of the interviewees didn't show us the pack. And so we were worried, so we did more studies, but in the end, it was not so much, because of fear of illicit, because people in Georgia consume illicit products of other type, but it was more of a shame that they don't smoke a better brand products. Next one. So in the end, what we found is that the overall prevalence of illicit trade was really, really low. It was about 1.5% overall in Georgia, which was contrast with something that was happening in Georgia about 10 years prior, before we instigated some good changes in terms of fighting corruption and better tax administration. At that time, 10 years ago, the market share of illicit was close to 60%. So basically by better tax administration, fighting corruptions, we were able to reduce the size of illicit market to about 1.5%. That's what we measured. The only problematic areas was area of Zugdidi. And then I mentioned there that there the prevalence was 6%. And it was mostly because it was close to occupied territory of Abkhazia that allowed the leakage of illegal cigarettes from Russia going to Georgia. Next, please. Yes, so you can see here that it was in different parts of the country. So the blue part of the graph indicates if people were aware of any illicit cigarette trade in their country. Can you buy, the question was, can you buy illegal cigarettes in the area if you wanted to? And you can see here in Zugdidi, that was the highest part. Next one. And next one, this is just like what people express their opinion about illicit cigarettes. And you know, here it shows if you had a cigarette that, if you know the cigarette is illicit, would you buy it? And primarily people just say, oh, sure, I would buy it. So it wasn't, then people didn't show us cigarettes. It wasn't because we were not, we're afraid of illegal products. I think in the end, we sort of concluded that our sample was sufficiently representative of the population that we sampled. And next one, I think is going to be almost the end, conclusions. So, and a little bit of a spoiler. So in Georgia was one of the countries that actually didn't have a tax increase also after the first we collected data. So we waited, we collected data second wave and third wave. So we had a tax increase between the second and third wave. That's a paper that I'm working on currently now. And then just as a spoiler, everything stayed the same despite the substantial tax increase, no change in prevalence and illicit trade, except for that Zugdidi area where it shoot up almost to 30%. So again, you know, because I think as, you know, there was a more influence of the Russian smuggling to Georgia. So the conclusion was basically it needs to be strong administration and focusing on the areas that are vulnerable, like close to this occupied territory. So that was the upshot of this. So yes, I think I end here. And so we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to all our speakers. So instead of summarizing what we've just heard, in the interest of time, we have 10 minutes left. Please do click on the Q&A box and fire off any questions that you have for any of the panelists. I'll give you a few seconds to see if there are any questions that come through. I also have a question which I'd like to ask one of the panelists while we wait for some more questions to come through. This could be a question for Hannah or for Segi. Is there more illicit trade closer to national borders and why?
Yeah, Tsegi, do you want to tell us about Mongolia? Because we studied border areas as well, right?
Yes. We had collected samples at the areas bordering with Russia and with China. So we didn't identify any difference whether the packs were collected in capital city or closer to the border. I think we had different scenario and picture from other countries like Georgia and Vietnam. So we didn't identify any difference closer to the border.
Yeah. And if I might just add about Georgia, they have border with Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia. All these borders were fine except for that occupied territory. So that's because in the occupied territory there is sort of the rule of law is a little bit loose. It's very tense area. There is there's military around, and I think that's sort of the role of these conflict areas in supplying illicit cigarette. I think that plays really important role in this case in Georgia. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. So we've got a question from David Merriman. How do you verify illicit cigarettes in Vietnam? This is for Anne. And more broadly, what did you find was the best way to verify a cigarette was illicit? So Anne, would you be able to answer that question, please? Thank you.
Yes. In Vietnam, according to our regulation, the a cigarette to be distributed in on the market must have both the stamp and the health warning graphic. So in our surveys, we go to the households and we meet with smokers and we ask them either to show us the pack that they smoked or they are purchased the last times, and we collect that pack and we take the pictures. So at the enumerator will check if the stamp is there or the health and the graphic health warning is there. So if yes, it will consider as licit. Otherwise, it considers illicit. So there are some concern about whether there's some counterfeiting in producing the stamp or the health warning to make it a kind of fake, a counterfeited cigarette. But actually, the counterfeited cigarette in Vietnam is not that common. So we can safely assume that the pack that have both the stamp and then the health warning will be considered as illicit, and those don't have that will consider as illicit. And that's how we identify licit and illicit in Vietnam. I don't know how other country will find the best way to verify a cigarette towards illicit or not. So yeah.
Thank you, Anne.
Okay.
Thank you. So we have another question, maybe for Hannah. Is there any difference in the quality of cigarettes between illicit and licit markets?
Yes, that's from my colleague Michael here at University of Cape Town. Yes and no. Okay, but so we have heard from Anne that actually the illegal cigarettes in Vietnam are more expensive. So obviously the smokers find them somehow more attractive. Are they of better quality or worse quality? Then there are these cheaper cigarettes that some people say, oh, it tastes really awful, right? So maybe are they worse or better quality or better, worse quality? The question is, will this cigarette is gonna kill you? It's gonna kill you either way. If it's quality, good quality, better quality, poor quality, it's a bad cigarette. And so I often compare this to jumping from the 13th floor or from the 10th floor. Illicit cigarette, maybe you're jumping from the 13th floor, legal cigarettes, you're jumping from the 10th floor. So both times, so it really doesn't really matter that much. And often we hear this, argument from the industry that the illegal cigarettes are of worse quality, but does it matter? Not really. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next question I'm going to throw out to all panelists. So for some studies, did any authors estimate a cross price elasticity between licit and illicit cigarettes? Hannah's smiling, or Anne, feel free.
No.
Actually, in this particular study, we did not estimate the cross elasticity between the licit and the illicit cigarette. But in a follow-up study that we are working on, we conducted a discrete choice experiment, and we are able to estimate that. And I think that study will come out very soon.
Thank you. We just had Dr. Bakhturidze join, and as we've got another 5 minutes, I can direct a question to him. So we know that a lot of countries have signed up to the WHO protocol to eliminate illicit trade, and that strong tax administration is one of the things that's called for governments to implement to tackle illicit trade. Dr. Bakhturidze, would you be able to speak to the experience of Georgia and the influence of tax administration reforms there? Okay, I don't think he switched on his camera yet, so we can, maybe Hannah could cover this question.
Sorry, I was more looking. Can you repeat it? I was paying
Yeah,
attention.
no worries. So it was just
thinking.
on the question of tax. I think he's got his, he's unmuted himself, but it was on the question of tax administration. Why is tax administration important in tackling illicit trade, and the interesting case of Georgia and what happened with tax reforms there?
Yeah. Is George, can he already speak? Or so, yeah, no, very important. I mean, and there's also a question from Estelle here, because Georgia quite doesn't have a track and trace. They have a good tax system that doesn't trace, it tracks back, but it doesn't trace the cigarettes. And it did help. It was one of the main reasons why we were able to reduce the illicit size of the illicit market from the 60% to the current 1%. You know, the tax administration is very efficient in Georgia. Everything is online. They can print you receipts from tax every month. You know, the end of the month, you have the proceeds from the tax. So yeah, very tightly controlled, and definitely that administration and the measures and the good tax stamps that they have definitely help Georgia to control or reduce the size of the. Yes, George, am I right?
Yes, yes, I can confirm. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you both. So what might be our final question, unless anybody else has an additional one? We have a question from Aminul from Bangladesh. Are there any findings related to the route of transportation of illicit tobacco trade? How have sellers received illicit cigarettes? I'm not sure if Sege or George could speak to this.
Sorry.
So the question was on the route of transportation of illicit trade and how sellers have received illicit cigarettes.
Yeah, as you know, we have some broken territories with border of Russia. Two our territories, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, are under control of Russian Federation now. And we have some difficulties, huge difficulties in those territories. We have administrative borders now, not official borders, because it's a part of Georgia. And one of the sensitive place for this issue is Abkhazia. And most part of illicit trade we have from Abkhazia. And there are cigarettes produced in Russia with a Russian excise tax or Abkhazian excise tax. And unfortunately, administrative measures are not so strong to avoid all cases related to control all tobacco goods delivered from broken territories of Abkhazia to internal part of Georgia. And through our study, we defined that most sensitive part is Zugdidi district, which is near to administrative border with Abkhazia. And it's mostly political issue and also international relations issue. And such kind of uncontrolled territories and broken territories creates so many difficulties with regard of smuggling products, including tobacco.
Thank you. And apologies to Estelle Dushi, who asked a question which I'm not sure we answered, but that could be our final question for those of you that are able to stay for another couple of minutes. And I'm going to direct this towards Hannah. Could you conclude that track and trace is a way to reduce illicit trade? Yes,
but we cannot say that using example from Georgia yet, because yes, in a sense that they did a lot of other things. They quite don't have a tracking and tracing, but they have a very good tax stamp system. They also work a lot on reducing corruption. And when we measured our size of illicit trade in Georgia, we already have all these systems in place. So through our study, we cannot make any conclusion about track and trace in Georgia or that system in Georgia because it was already in place. So, but we have seen, as there's some evidence from Kenya, for example. So yeah, these studies are actually not as common. And I think it's mostly because the track and trace is relatively new in many countries. And in the implementation of track and trace also depends on a particular system that is in place, not track. So we have a low track and trace, medium track and trace, and the best track and trace, like a car. We would have like Mercedes, top notch, or we would have Volkswagen. So, and therefore these systems also have different effectiveness. So it's and because they have not been in place for such a long time, it's difficult to judge their impact. And also because they're usually run by private companies, and private companies tend to keep close their data. So we don't, very difficult to get for researchers to get a hold of these private data. That's another. So, but definitely a big room for investigation here. And I'm happy to join any team that wants to do study of this type. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you to everybody who logged in today, to all our contributors and all our panelists that took part. If you're interested in finding out more, do go and read our supplement in BMJ Tobacco Control. It's entitled Measuring Illicit Trade in Tobacco Control in Low and Middle Income Countries. So if you'd like more information, then that would expand on that for you. So thank you everybody again for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.